All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. So you guys should have your regular professor back on Monday, and it's been a good 2 weeks. So thanks for being so kind and polite to me. You guys really are polite, which is great. I laugh, but that's a good laugh. Yeah, it was nice being in here. Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to compare the French Revolution to the American Revolution, and we're going to spend some time looking at the works of Edmund Burke, which you have just a brief selection from that appears right after we have the Washington address in here. So I brought some other things in from Burke to talk about him. And let me give you a bit of a background for what we're going to be looking at here. So if you look at a lot of standard textbooks, they will almost always call the time period of the 1770s and the 1780s the age of revolutions. And quite typically, they mean this in the sense that the American and French revolutions were something similar to one another. And one of the points that we try to make at Hillsdale and through this class is that they really couldn't be more different, that they really do stand for radically different things. So the American Revolution, which of course is, we'll just give it 1776 here just to make it easy, with the Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution is a revolution that really does attempt to try and get an understanding of society from the bottom up. That is, it wants to have community. It looks at things like family. Churches really matter. They all play this significant role in it. But then when we look to the French Revolution, and again, just to give it a quick date, we'll give it 1789 when it passes its Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The French Revolution, from its beginning, was an attempt to establish a kind of national unity over everything from the top down. So rather than from the bottom up, you get this idea from the top down. And so let's just compare two things. One we've talked about in class, and one we haven't. So if for a moment you'll turn, I'd appreciate it if you would, if you'll turn to the Old Northwest Ordinance, which I know we've already gone over, but turn to the Northwest Ordinance, and in particular, page 141. And here on 141, oh, thanks. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Hope. Yeah, thank you. Here on 141, we have one of 6 articles, of course, and these 6 articles are the articles that help define what this attempt at creating a republic is all about. Now, interestingly enough, both the Americans and the French claim they're forming a republic. Right? So you've got to keep that in mind. They use some of the same language. For those of you who had a chance to read the Robespierre for today, you know that he talks in the language of morality and of virtue, uses much the same kind of language that we would already have seen in the American context, but he uses them in slightly different ways. His idea of virtue is more about force than it is about free choice. But if you look at the bottom of Article the Second on page 141, right there around line 31, and in the just preservation of rights and property, it is understood and declared that no law ought ever be made or have force in the said territory that shall in any manner whatsoever interfere with or affect private contracts or engagements without fraud being previously detected. So we can form any kind of association we want with one another. Right? This could be a marriage association. This could be an educational association. We want to found a school like Hillsdale College. We could form our own religion. We could form our own business. And notice that the way the language is written here in the Northwest Ordinance, there are no exceptions to this unless fraud has been detected. So as long as any 2 of us in this room, or any 3 of us, or any 10 of us in this room create a contract, and that contract has to do with us associating with one another, and we've not in some way been engaged in fraud with one another, we can create any association we want. This, to me, is kind of the ultimate standard of the American Revolution, this idea that we have the right to associate. So I don't know what you guys did on the first day in this class, but I would assume you probably looked at the Mayflower Compact. Right? And at least if you didn't, you did it in the first day or two. And that's one of those ultimate examples of the ability of people to come together only armed with their religious beliefs, with scripture, with the common law, and they're able to make a community out of that. That's incredible at every level, that you would have something that audacious. And there's really no other word for it. It is audacious in every way, that these people feel that they have the ability to form and create their own community. They don't listen to a bishop. They don't listen to a pope. They don't listen to a king. They don't listen to a bureaucrat. They make this decision on their own as a group of people to make this thing. And please don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to knock Catholics here. But you can imagine Catholics at the same time would have had lots and lots of hierarchy in order to try and create what they were doing. Protestants, being Protestant by their very nature, are extremely individualistic and communitarian in a very different kind of sense. Now, if you had had Catholics, sorry, just to get a little patriotism in here, if you had had Catholics in, say, 1200 do this, or 1215, they would have given you the Magna Carta. It would have been all cool and great. But by the time you get to what we have with the Mayflower Compact, and later, things have become bureaucratized to a great degree. So you really see this here among Protestants, in particular, this ability to be able to create this thing and do this. So this passage here, at the end of Article the Second for the Northwest Ordinance, really is kind of the great statement of an understanding of what association is, our ability to associate one with another in the middle of a revolution, and our idea of what society is. But then turn to page 196. Is that 141? We turn to page 196, and we see something quite different. This is the French understanding of a similar idea, but not exact. And we have this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen passed on August 26th of 1789. This is their equivalent of our Declaration of Independence or of our Northwest Ordinance. It is a declaration of sentiments. It's a declaration of statements. And look at point number 3 there at the top of 196. The principle of all sovereignty. Language there, very important. There are no exceptions. The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. So I hope it's clear that if we took Article the Second from the Northwest Ordinance and we placed it right next to Article 3 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, they would combust in some kind of nuclear explosion here. They simply cannot occupy the same space. They are saying exactly the opposite. Yeah, Zach.
What does nation mean?
Yeah, great question. They mean the people as a whole, right? So the body of citizens. So unlike in the Northwest Ordinance, Zach, unlike in the Northwest Ordinance, where we have the right to associate with one another without political interference, unless there's fraud. Right? If there's fraud, all bets are off. But unless there's fraud, we can't get involved. But here, we have it essentially in the nation. So if you and I wanted to form a business, we could probably do so, but we have to get permission from the body as a whole before we do that. So completely the opposite of what we were seeing. So jump down to point number 6. And here we have a further elucidation of this. Law is the expression of the general will. Every citizen has a right to participate personally or through his representatives in its formation. It must be the same for all, whether it protects or punishes. All citizens, being equal in the eyes of the law, are equally eligible to all dignities and to all public positions and occupations according to their abilities and without distinction except that of their virtues and talents. But everything comes together in this general will and what that will is, which is the body of the whole in some way or another. So we need to think about this and try and understand what the French are doing versus what the Americans are doing. But they see things as coming together as a body of a whole. Now here's where it gets really complicated. And the way, especially the question that Zach asked, and how do we know this? So one of the great persons behind all of this is a guy named JeanJacques Rousseau, who's a really interesting figure, who had been a philosopher. He's passed away at this point by the time that they write this. But he'd been a really interesting figure, and in 1762, he had written a book called On the General Will, or On Equality. And so that book that he creates, also called On the Social Contract, but in that book, what he describes is this kind of wild, and this is hard to explain. So if it doesn't make sense, if I'm not explaining it well, don't hesitate to stop me at all. So what he argues is that in a society, unlike in the American case where we are endowed with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, Rousseau says we willingly give up every single right and advantage we have. And we essentially, as he says, we strip ourselves naked in the public square. So we take away everything that we claim to be metaphysical to who and what we are. And we combine with one another in this general will. But each of us absolutely stripped of all of our rights, so we never, ever make a claim on any other person in the group because we've stripped ourselves of all of that. But we also, in this general will, his idea of the individual is not quite what our idea of the individual is. So, for example, I see right in the front row we have someone wearing a Pi-Phi shirt, which I'm very glad you're wearing, because it indicates that we have some kind of connection to something greater than who and what we are. So, not to be self-absorbed here, I'm not a Pi-Phi, but if, for example, I were to explain myself, I might explain myself in a given context as an American, but I always identify first as a Kansan, identify as a Burzer, I identify as a father of 7 kids, I identify as a Roman Catholic, I identify as someone who went to the University of Notre Dame. I mean, there are all kinds of things that I have that are extremely important to who and what I am as a person. And I would also say, being a good American, or at least an attempt at a good American, I would say that I definitely have natural rights, life, liberty, and property. I would argue all of those things. What Rousseau says is that when we stand in the public square, we make none of those claims, none at all, that those claims no longer matter. All that matters is the raw individual. And this would be the difference philosophically in what we call an individual, someone who is stripped of their inheritance, stripped of what they are, versus a person. A person is always connected in relationship to other persons. And that's what that's what Rousseau is getting at with this idea of the general will. So his idea of freedom is that we all celebrate our freedom individually, but as a collective. So we're individuals in the sense that we've been stripped of everything that we are. We stand naked in the public square, all of us absolutely equal to every other individual within the public square. So we would never, ever talk about our excellences in the public square. We would only talk about the lowest common denominator. That's that which makes us utterly all equal, our physical human self. That's it. So does that make sense for everyone? I think this is a very difficult concept, but this is what Rousseau calls the general will. And it's difficult for us because, frankly, as Americans, we have been brought up with exactly the opposite understanding. And when we hear words like individualism, we think John Wayne, or we think some rugged guy who's gone out and made maybe Steve Jobs or someone who has really made something of himself. But that's not at all what individualism means in this context. Here it means basically absolute conformity, one person with every other person. Right? Yeah.
Is that essentially like every dystopian novel?
I could have just described every dystopian novel, couldn't I? That's a great question. Yes. This has, at least, again, for us, this has a very science fiction kind of crazy element to it. Absolutely. And what do we know from all dystopian novels? Do they ever work?
They end very poorly.
They always end very, very poorly and very, very violently. Absolutely. So let's just think about this for a moment. This is a great question and a great point. So let's think about this. When we think of the American Revolution, we think of things like Lexington. We think of violence. But what do we think of when we think of the French Revolution? What's the first image that comes to mind of the French Revolution? What's the great symbol, Gabe?
Mad guillotine.
Yeah, the guillotine, right? This is our great symbol. And notice, you don't use a guillotine in war, right? That would be an incredibly inefficient tool out on the battlefield. Okay, enemies, line up, right? This would be crazy. A guillotine is absolutely an instrument for personal terror among your own citizens, right? And so think about that distinction we make. And we know now, and we've got great records for this, we know that the French Revolution ended up murdering about 50,000 of their own people, right? So they beheaded roughly 50,000. Now, who do you think they're actually beheading? I mean, there are some elites, but there aren't 50,000 elites in France. They're beheading common peasants. That's who they're beheading, right? And it's slaughter. It's mass slaughter. So the French Revolution, not surprisingly, goes off in a radically different direction than ours does. And there's some really crazy things about it as well. We know that, of course, they try and start over at year zero, always very dangerous, like a dystopian novel. They try and start over at year zero. They rename the weeks. They rename the months. They rename the days. They rename the months. They do all of this and start over again. And it's hell. It's absolute hell. And it just gets worse and worse between about 1791 and 1794. It is terror, nothing more than terror. And they try to export this to the rest of the world as well. And that becomes a huge part of the revolution. But this is where it gets really sticky for us, because not only are both the Americans and the French proclaiming themselves to be republics, but they also talk in terms of being a revolution. And so we, to this day, still have this problem in the English language of what a revolution is. A revolution, by its very definition, of course, means that you start at one point and you revolve all the way back to the exact same point. A revolution would be a 360-degree movement, right? That would be the revolution. That's not, however, how, for example, most people use it. A revolution usually means 180 degrees when we talk about it in the political sense. That is, we're overturning the thing that is there to start anew. So when we think about revolutions, you've got something like the American Revolution, which in many ways is 360 degrees, not quite, but somewhat close, especially in its embrace of the Roman and the English traditions and trying to get back to the common understanding of what those traditions are. But then you think of a revolution like the French Revolution, or I'll jump forward to the Mexican Revolution of 1917, or to the Soviet Revolution of 1917, or to the Chinese Revolution of 1949, or the Cuban Revolution 10 years later. And there we have the revolution in which it's 180 degrees, an overturning of everything that is there. And one really important marker, I'll get you in a second, Spencer, one really important marker here, and I mentioned this 20 minutes ago, but one very important marker is to understand where the religious body is. Now, this does not work in the Islamic world at all, but in the Judeo-Christian world, you can generally determine if a revolution is going to be 360 degrees, almost always the religious bodies support it. If the religious bodies are against it, it will almost always be 180 degrees. That is, it'll be an overturning of society. So it's not accidental that in the Mexican Revolution of 1917, Catholicism was for a time outlawed and priests were martyred. Same thing was true in the Soviet Revolution, where all the Orthodox priests were the first people lined up on bridges and then machine gunned down. So you almost always have this distinction in terms of where the religious body, the predominant religious body is. Whereas in America, most of our ministers and preachers were absolutely on the side of the American Revolution, and were in fact leading it in all kinds of ways, like we talked about with Jonas Clark. So, okay, Spencer, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, the word revolution actually comes from the Latin word revolvo, or revolvo, which comes from the word volvo, which means to turn, and the prefix re, which means to again or back. So to turn again or to turn back.
I didn't know that. That's cool. Thanks. So to go back to what it was, right? Yeah,
Or to
thank
turn
you.
again.
That's very good. Okay, excellent. All right, anybody on this in the distinction? If not, I want to talk about Burke and why he's important. But as long as you're clear on the difference between the French and the American Revolution. So I'm obviously giving you the extreme. There are subtle things in which there are some connections. Thomas Paine being both an American revolutionary and a French revolutionary shows that there are connections as well. But overall, the intents of each revolution are quite different in how they're trying to play out. And I think we can say, in a lot of ways, the French have never totally recovered from their revolution. There's still their political instability, the fact they're on their fifth republic. But then again, we have our own, we had that little thing called the Civil War. And so we're not exactly perfect by any means at all. Hope.
It almost seems like in the Declaration of Rights of Man, it's more democratic than republic. Like, is that like a bit of a differentiation? Like, the American Revolution really focused on a functioning republic, whereas the French Revolution was more, power to the people, pure democracy, but let's call it a republic kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Edmund Burke argued that it was, in fact, you could call it democratic, but he said it was really more akin to totalitarianism. That is, its democracy, because it had this general will, was not a simple majority. It was mob rule, essentially. So where you have, maybe the majority of people, but they're behaving in such an animalistic and passionate fashion. Animalistic here, I mean that in the old Aristotelian sense, right? That they're allowing their passions to rule, that's where they're coming from. But he talks about them as being a totalitarian. He doesn't say totalitarianism, because there's no ism yet, but he does talk about totality. And he also talks about, and this especially after our previous election, this will probably rub some people the wrong way, but he also talks about this as the first form of nationalism in world history, that this is the first extreme nationalism where the nation becomes the whole. But they use the language of democracy, but the nation becomes the whole overall. Yeah. And this is, by the way, I said there's no such thing as an ism yet, but isms will become a part of the language immediately after the French Revolution as scholars try to figure out what the French Revolution was. So ologies and isms, ideology will become a word here in just a moment. So, yeah. Does that kind of help, Hope?
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot depends on how we mean democracy, and how we're defining that. Okay, so let me talk about Edmund Burke for a bit. Edmund Burke is one of my favorite guys in all of history. I'm actually rather obsessed with Edmund Burke, for better or for worse. I'm very proud to say, you guys don't have to put this in your notes or anything, but I just finally found volume number 6 of his 10 volumes of his letters. It took me almost 10 years to find a copy because they printed a whole bunch in the 50s and 60s and then they went out of print. And so they're very hard to find, but I now own all 10 volumes of his letters, and they're really good. And that just happened this fall, so I was very, very excited about that, to be able to get that. Burke was this guy, and I'll just put it this way. I'll just kind of be extreme and throw the gauntlet down for a moment. Burke is the single most important supporter of the American Revolution who is not an American. And he always, from the moment that the American Revolution began, the first time the British cared about it, starting in about 1765 with the Stamp Act, Burke's very first speech that he ever gives in Parliament, the speech that he gives in January of 1766, which the British refer to as either the Virgin or the Maiden speech. In that speech, he spent the entire time criticizing British policy towards America. And what Edmund Burke argued was that we need to maintain, in relations between America and Britain, ideally, not an imperial stance, but a Commonwealth stance. That is, we should look at the relationship between Britain and America as a brotherhood of republics, rather than as one being subordinate to the other in an imperial situation. And he's not alone in this. There was another guy At least I'd like you to know his name. I doubt if Anna's going to test you on him. But a good guy who was the British Prime Minister at the end of the French and Indian War, a guy by the name of William Pitt the Elder. He also had a similar kind of view that the Americas needed to be left alone in order to allow Britain to thrive. That is, Britain as an empire would do better if she regarded America as an equal and allowed her to trade as much as possible rather than regulating and taxing her. When you regulate and tax America, you actually decrease the overall wealth for all involved. So it's an Adam Smith free trade argument, and not surprisingly, Adam Smith is one of Edmund Burke's closest friends. So they're making the argument that it's better to allow trade to be involved here and to treat one another essentially as equals than to have one subordinate to the other. So Burke, throughout his entire parliamentary career, from the time period of 1766 all the way up to the passage of the Treaty of Paris, which ends the war with Britain, in 1783, he spends that time speaking about almost nothing other than American rights. And he's adamant about this. So, for example, and this is crazy that he did this and he barely got away with it, but the king, that is George III, would on certain days declare a fast day. He would say, today we pray for all the soldiers in America who are fighting to suppress this rebellion. And Burke would stand up in Parliament and he would say, I counter that. I declare this a feast day, and anyone who would like to come to my house and celebrate American soldiers as the true Brits are welcome to come over. And he did this all the time to counter what the king was doing. This is treason. It's absolutely treason. And he even went further. In one speech, he said that he refused to take communion in the Anglican Church because the head of the Anglican Church was the King of Britain. The King of Britain was abusing his own people by attacking American soldiers, and therefore, he said, this is a synagogue of Satan, not a temple of Christ. So he's now comparing King George to Satan, right? That's incredible that he was able to get away with that. Now, he and George actually become good friends after the war, which is pretty crazy. But during the war, they are opposite of one another. And really, I can't stress enough how dangerous this situation was for Edmund Burke, that he kept doing this over and over again. I really do think we should regard him as much as a patriot as we would someone like George Washington. And he was in constant danger for what he was doing as well. After the war, he also defended other rights. So talk about a good guy who's anti-slavery, right, wanted to end the slave trade. He was all in favor of Asian Indians having autonomy apart from the British Empire, and especially religious freedom that the Hindus should be able to practice as they saw fit. There's even a moment at one point where a number of Hindus are visiting London and they ask for permission to be able to say their services in the local churches, and the local churches all deny them. And so Burke opens up his home to them where they can practice the Hindu ceremony in his house. This is a guy of incredible tolerance, and he's in favor of releasing all the Irish from the bondage of the British as well. And he's also in favor of giving Roman Catholics full rights. Roman Catholics have no rights in Britain until 1832. So you can't vote, you can't participate in politics if you're a Roman Catholic, none of that. So Burke is trying very hard to really defend the rights of all of these various people. And then he does something that absolutely shocks everybody. He comes out 100% against the French Revolution immediately, from day one. The moment that the rights of man and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen is passed, Burke begins to write his most famous book called Reflections on the Revolution in France, in which he challenges it. So here he is. He's defended the rights of Americans. He's defended the rights of Asian Indians, of African blacks. He's defended the right of the Irish and of Roman Catholics. And then he says, but not the French. At least not in this manner at all. And people are truly stunned. It's like, wait a minute, what's happened to Burke? And there's some people, like his friend Thomas Paine, claimed that Burke had gone crazy. He'd lost it. But Burke writes 3 books about why the French Revolution is dangerous. He writes Reflections on the Revolution in France, then he writes further reflections on the Revolution in France. That may be Burke's only really great mistake. He needed a better title than that. Should do something beyond just further reflections. But then his final book is a great title called Letters of a Regicide Peace. Right? That's a good title for a book. But he writes 3 books about the French Revolution and why it's dangerous. So we're going to read here, and if someone would read out loud, I'd really appreciate it. I'd like you to read the final paragraph. This is on page 208 of the writings that you have from Burke. Anybody want to? Thanks, Spencer. So taking it for granted, that whole thing.
Taking it for granted that I do not write to the disciples of the Parisian philosophy, I may assume that the awful author of our being is the author of our place in the order of existence, and that having disposed and marshaled us by a divine tactic, not according to our will, but according to his, he has, in and by that disposition, virtually subjected us to act the part which belongs to the place assigned us. We have obligations to mankind at large, which are not in consequence of any special voluntary pact. They arise from the relation of man to man and the relation of man to God, which relations are not matters of choice. On the contrary, the force of all the pacts which we enter into with any particular person or number of persons among mankind depends on those prior obligations. In some cases, the subordinate relations are voluntary. In others, they are necessary, but the duties are all compulsive. When we marry, the choice is voluntary, but the duties are not matter of choice. They are dictated by the nature of the situation. Dark and inscrutable are the ways by which we come into the world. The instincts which give rise to this mysterious process of nature are not of our making, but of our physical causes, unknown to us, perhaps unknowable, arise a moral relation. But, consenting or not, they are bound to a long train of burdensome duties towards those with whom they have never made a convention of any sort. Children are not consenting to their relation, but their relation, without their actual consent, binds them to their duties. Or rather, it implies their consent, because the presumed consent of every rational creature is in unison with the predisposed order of things. Men come in that manner into a community with the social state of their parents, endowed with all the benefits, loaded with all the duties of their situation. If the social ties and ligaments spun out of those physical relations which are the elements of our commonwealth, in most cases begin, and always continue, independently of our will, so without any stipulation on our own part, are we bound by that relation called our country, which comprehends, as it has been well said, all the charities of all. Nor are we left without powerful instincts to make this duty as dear and grateful to us as it is awful and coercive. Our country is not a thing of mere physical locality. It consists, in a great measure, into the ancient order into which we are born. We may have the same geographical situation, but another country, as we may have the same country in another soil. The place that determines our duty to our country is a social, civil relation.
All right, nice job, Spencer. There's a lot going on in this. Yeah, a lot. And this, I would like to remind everybody, this was a speech given in Parliament. So we're expecting the audience to be able to get everything that Burke is saying. And in this one paragraph, Burke is challenging the entire notion of the general will and of what's going on in the Rousseauvian understanding of Rousseauvian after Rousseau, the Rousseauvian understanding of the French Revolution. So let's break this down into a couple of parts. Think about, and this gets back to Hope's question earlier, think about the idea of what the demos or the democracy is, what the nation is. There on line 36, our country is not a thing of fear, of mere physicality. Right? It's something greater than that. And of course, remember, we've just come out of a revolution in terms of the Americans breaking away from the British, in which they are the same people, but are rejecting one another because of the relationship that has gone sour between them. So there's a very important element here that we have to understand, that who are we as a people? Well, it's very similar to what George Washington said when we talked about this on Wednesday. Our country is a greater thing than the soil we're on. Our country is our relationship with all women and men of goodwill throughout time. And that Burke is stressing that very strongly here, that we have a relationship with all kinds of people. And you think about what we do at Hillsdale, clearly from the moment you get here at Hillsdale, or at least within a few weeks, but really at that, remember that oath you guys all took on the first day that you got here at Hillsdale, that wild oath on that Sunday afternoon, where you basically pledged yourself to the Platonic God to pursue the good, the true, and the beautiful in everything that you do. Right? That oath, if you go back and look at it, it is a serious, serious oath. I know that day you all had a billion things on your mind, and you're standing there with your folks, and you're worried about getting moved into your dorms and everything else. But that oath is incredible. And what it does is it introduces you to a country and makes you a citizen of something larger than what you have on your passport. You suddenly become one with Plato and with Aristotle, and you become one not just with them, but all people who will come in the future as well, all women and men of goodwill. You become a community with them. Anybody know the old term for this? Cicero. And if you didn't talk about this in Western Heritage, it's okay. But Cicero had a term for this. He called this the cosmopolis. We belong to the cosmopolis, the city of the cosmos, in which all men and women belong to it, who are able to use capital R reason, which is the language of the God. Right? This is what reason is. It's the language of the God. It allows us to speak to the God, and it allows us to speak to one another. So this is reason. And that's exactly what Burke is doing here. Our country is not a thing of mere physicality, of locality. It consists in a great measure in the ancient order into which we are born. We may have the same geographical situation, but another country, as we may have the same country in another soil. The place that determines our duty to our country is a social and civil relationship. Everything's relational. So you are not, as you would be in the French understanding, a merely abstracted individual. You are a person. And as a person, you are defined by your relationships. You're defined by being a sister or a brother or a daughter or a grandson. You're defined by being a nephew, or you're defined by being a friend. You're defined in a variety of different ways. All of us coming into this room with a million different relationships. And just think about, even though I only get to have you guys for 2 weeks, think about how much we all know about each other more than we did 2 weeks ago. Because in some way, we have mixed our physicality. Our locality has become the same within this classroom, and we've created a community within a community. I've even gotten to know most of your names, which is stunning, frankly. I was able to do that. Not everybody, but almost everybody. That's pretty incredible, and I've enjoyed it. But regardless, we've had that. And you'll resume your normal community on Monday when Anna's back, and you'll continue that community for the rest of the semester. So these communities matter in the way that we interact with one another. And Burke tells us it's not just community that is huge, but it is also the community that is small within the community that is huge. So one of his most famous passages, you guys don't have this, I'm bringing this in from the end of his reflections on the Revolution in France. He says, we always begin our public affections in our families. Right? No mere general will. We begin our affections in our families. There are no cold relations in a truly zealous citizen. Right? One of the reasons I love America is because America allowed me to have the mother and the father that I have. America allowed my parents to be able to raise me in a way that they saw fit, with which I agree and have come to agree and have come to see. They were able to raise me in a religion that I believe in. They were able to teach me a language that I find beautiful and sacred. They did all of these things, but my relationship was not as I was born in Great Bend, Kansas. It was not suddenly to America. It was to my mother and to my father. And from there, things grow. Then to my brothers, then to my neighbors, then to my aunts and my uncles, and everything as you spread from there. But all relationships begin at this very beginning level, right? The place that determines our duty to our country is a social civil relation. So, again, Burke, we begin our public affections in our families. No cold relation is a zealous citizen. We pass on to our neighborhoods and our habitual provincial connections. And then there are the inns and the resting places, and such divisions of our country as have been formed by habit and not by sudden jerk of authority. Think about those things we believe in. Most of us obey the law not because we feel that we will be reprimanded severely if we ignore the law, but because we think the law is right. And when we recognize a law is wrong, then we do disobey it, and we're willing to take the consequences for that. But it's because it doesn't mesh with us. We don't like the sudden jerk of authority. And in so many little things, the image of the great country in which the heart finds something which it could fill. And then one of my favorite lines from Edmund Burke, the love of the whole is not extinguished by the love of the subordinate partiality. My love of my mother does not take away my love of country. It does exactly the opposite. So it's not as though I have only a set love, and once that love is taken, it's zero sum. It's expansive, right? And that's what Burke is telling us. So think about what he says here at the very beginning of this passage, which Spencer so nicely read. Taking it for granted that I do not write to the disciples of the Parisian philosophy, right? I'm no French revolutionary. You all know that. Right? And by this point, you're probably sick of me saying it, right? He's telling Parliament. But what does he assume? I assume that the awful author of our being. All right, well, that sounds a little negative at first, but awful just means properly to be filled with awe. So God, who is the author of all things, who has filled me with awe of who and what he is, has, in the order of existence, disposed and marshaled us by a divine tactic, not according to our will, but according to his. Now, we don't have to agree with Burke on this exactly, but I want you to see what he just did. One of the great questions of all of Western civilization is how much free will do we have versus how much we are predestined to do something. Burke just attempted to answer that in one sentence. And he said, well, when it comes to free will, we have absolutely zero when it comes to when we're born. I didn't get to choose September 6, 1967. I didn't choose to be born into a German Catholic family. I didn't choose my mother or my father or my brothers. I chose none of that. None of that had I anything to do with. But, he says, the moment that we come of age and of reason, then every choice we ever make is up to us. So there's this kind of beautiful mix of both being predestined and having free will at the same time. And those choices are then critical. In other words, much like what Washington said on Wednesday, every decision we make matters. No matter how small the decision may seem, it absolutely matters. But what do we know? And one of my favorite sentences for Burke, what do we know about all of this? Look at that on line 20. Again, I would give so much for any politician to speak like this in the on the floor of Congress. Dark and inscrutable are the ways by which we come into the world. All the mystery of our existence, right there in one sentence. Dark and inscrutable. We didn't get to choose any of that. But the moment we can choose, we do choose. And yet, what do we find? I had all the choice in the world before I married my wife. When we were courting one another, when I was courting her, when we were dating, I had all the choice in the world. She could have walked away. I could have walked away. We could have said no. We didn't. Things happened. They happened very quickly. They were great. Here we are. A quarter of a century later, things have been good. I've been blessed. But it could have gone a different way. It didn't. But I had all the choice in the world until that day I got married. And once I got married, almost every choice flew out the window. because now I have duties. I have duties to her as her husband. She has duties to me as my wife. I have duties to our kids as their father. And those are not things that I can get away from, nor would I want to. But all of those things are suddenly dictated by the situation. So I can still make choices. I can make very, very, very bad choices. And I can make very, very good choices. But Burke tells us what matters is the circumstance. In other words, think about what all of you are doing right now. You could behave as a student, which is the right thing to do, or you could suddenly become strange and idiotic. You could do something, you could blurt something out. You could all develop Tourette's for a moment. And we could have a completely chaotic classroom. But that would be bizarre. And it would be bizarre if I suddenly started doing something that was just completely out of the norm. In other words, when I walk in as a professor and you walk in as a student, there's an expectation of behavior. There's a way that we understand. Now, you still have free will, but your will is also being shaped by the choices you should be making. And we do act that way. So Tom so graciously got me a cup of coffee earlier. Was that last week or this week?
Last week.
Last week, right? It was so kind of him to do that. No matter what, I will never look at him quite the same. Because he wasn't just my student for a bit. He was that guy, he was my grunt for a bit, who went off and got me coffee. And he did it without complaint. And as far as I know, he brought me back all the proper change. I didn't double check, but I'm assuming.
Give or take a couple.
Right? I mean, those things, this is the relation that Burke is telling us. So we can't, in things like dystopian society, we cannot simply assume that you will behave in a certain way and do this, that you will strip yourselves naked in the public square and become absolutely equal all with one another and follow some predetermined course. Burke says, and think about what this paragraph is, life is messy. Real life is messy. It is complicated. And we can't predetermine everything. Only God can. And even that is beyond our ability to understand. It is dark and inscrutable, though awful in the best sense, full of awe and praising. Okay, you guys all see the difference between, you guys get Burke a little bit too, hopefully? All right, thanks everybody, and thanks for the last 2 weeks. It's been a nice break for me. So, good luck next week. I know you have your exam on Wednesday. I hope it goes well.